Hi, I'm Len Epp from Lean Pub, and in this Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Andriy Burkov. Based in Quebec City, Andriy is an expert in artificial intelligence and a senior data scientist leading a machine learning team at the global research and advisory firm Gartner. You can follow him on Twitter at Burkov, great handle by the way, and read his articles by finding his profile on LinkedIn. Andriy is the author of the best-selling book, the 100-page machine learning book, everything you really need to know in machine learning in 100 pages. Whether you're new to the topic or you're an expert in the field, the book provides a concise way to learn and to communicate and to think about some of the most important aspects of machine learning. If you're a business executive or you're working on the management side of things, it gives you the information you need to start asking the right questions if you're approaching a problem that you think might be machine learnable. In this interview, we're going to talk about Andriy's background and career, professional interests, machine learning and artificial intelligence generally, and at the end we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a successful self-published author. So thank you for being on the Lean Pub Front Matter podcast.
Thank you, Len, for inviting. I was hesitating, as you know, first, but after a couple of podcasts, I actually realized that it's quite a pleasant experience. So thanks for inviting me once again.
Yeah, thanks for that. I listened to a couple of podcasts that you did recently in preparing for this interview, and I'm really looking forward to our chat. So I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. Your story has quite a few chapters in it, I think it's fair to say. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you first became interested in computers and technology generally.
Well, I was born in the Soviet Union in 1980, and my first 11 years I spent as a normal Soviet schoolboy. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, my family and I, we have become part of Ukraine, and because my parents met in Sevastopol when they both were students in Sevastopol State University, which is in Crimea, and they decided to, well, not decided, but they managed to stay in Crimea because at the time of Soviet Union, young engineers could not really decide where they will spend the beginning of their career. Normally, they were sent somewhere to the north or some small city, small town where there is some kind of factory and they need engineers. But luckily, my mother's father was a member of a communist party and high profile member, so he managed to let my parents stay in Crimea. So I was lucky to have born there because it's sunny, not so cold. There is a sea that the swimming season is quite long. So I've got quite a nice childhood. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, it has become near to disaster. Like nobody got any job. My parents tried to meet ends and work it everywhere possible, and sometimes the salary was paid in food. So we spent 3 years of my university bachelor's in university without any electricity in the city for 3 years, and I remember doing my homework under the candlelight and trying to do some high mathematics. And in the university, there were hours where the computer lab were open, so you have to subscribe to have 1 hour to do all your programming homeworks. If you don't manage to do it, there is another person waiting. So you should really think fast. And so I finished my master's in the Sevastopol State University as a computer scientist with the bias towards computer network engineering. And while I was a student, the last 2 years, I was also a startup founder for several, what they call it at the time, portals, online portals that everybody wanted to build at the time, at the .com era. And the portal that I created to contain it, almost everything like a typical start portal should contain, like weather forecasts, online games, horoscopes, forums, chats, and stuff like this. And it went well until the crisis of .coms. And then during the crisis, my investor was still able to support my work for a couple of hours, but then everybody was so disappointed with online markets. So he said that nobody actually believes that anything will work out of the internet activities, and we closed it, which was in retrospective a mistake, because just like several years after, it's all restarted once again. But once I realized that I cannot continue working on my online startups, I quickly figured out that I will not easily find another investor. So I decided to move somewhere where doing online business would be easier. And in the beginning, I looked at France, because we thought it was very romantic with my ex-wife to speak French and live somewhere like south of France with typical French music around us and so on. So we were young and romantic. And when we started to learn French, I started to look like at the technical side of like immigrating from Ukraine to some Western country, and we quickly realized that immigrating from Ukraine into Europe would be very complicated, and normally you don't have the right to look for a job until you have the right to be permanently resident in France. So to get this permanent residency was also complicated, because there were so many conditions, like having a job or being a student. So I started to look elsewhere, and because we were planning to go to somewhere French, I was really lucky to find out that in Canada there is a province called Quebec where people speak French, and there is a normal immigration program where you can just fill some forms, describe your profile, prove that you can speak French, and it's all becomes much more easy.
Just to jump in there, thanks a lot for that. That's such an interesting story, and I have a lot of questions to ask about the next part of your journey. I actually lived in Quebec for about 6 or 7 years, in Montreal myself, so I'm a little familiar with life there. But also another sort of coincidence is that my grandparents immigrated to Canada from Ukraine. In the early part of the 20th century. What precipitated their departure was some very well-known political events I shouldn't be laughing about it, but, in Russia and particularly in Ukraine. But before talking about your adventures in Canada, so you were born in the Soviet Union, and then you lived in an independent country called Ukraine for a while. But if you went back there now, it would be part of Russia. And I wanted to ask you if you can tell us a little bit about what life was like for people during the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula by Russia, and whether or not you personally were surprised by the whole thing.
I think that the whole question the answer will be very different depending on who you talk to, and there are people who really enjoyed what happened, and there were people who really suffered because of this. And I know about families being split because, for example, my best friend from school was a high-profile Ukraine military officer, and he served in Crimea. And when everything happened, he was one of those who left Crimea and moved to mainland Ukraine, if you want. And now his parents live in Crimea. They have lots of property there, and they actually wanted their son to live there with them and so on, but their son cannot even go to see them to Crimea because no military from Ukraine can actually go to Crimea anymore. So there are families broken, and it's like unavoidable when conflicts like this happen. But as I said, it's one side of the coin. Another side of the coin that there were a lot of families who actually from the very beginning of the Soviet Union collapse actually felt betrayed by Yeltsin because Yeltsin agreed that Crimea will become part of Ukraine after the collapse. And I myself, I come from a Russian, ethnical Russian family. So for us, speaking Russian and our Russian identity was very important. And I should admit that Ukraine wanted like Ukrainize, if you want, like convert Russians into Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian way of doing things, and not many ethnical Russian who left in Crimea actually enjoyed this. And I could give you some like very simple example. For example, if you buy drugs in pharmacy, the instructions for the drugs was only in Ukrainian. Even if you're native Russian and you don't speak Ukrainian, you don't read Ukrainian, you have to like buy drugs with instruction in Ukrainian on your own risk. So if you misinterpret the directions, it could be really like risky. Or if you go to cinema, all movies were in Ukrainian. You have no choice like to watch movies in your own language. So from this perspective, I think a lot of people really wanted to become part of Russia. Whether they are happy now, it's another question, because it went, according to my parents, it all went very smoothly, so there were no quite any violence. Maybe one person died or something like this. But what the whole situation created around Crimea is isolation, and this isolation is especially felt by young people, because like for my parents, they are fine. Their retirement allocation has like doubled, so they really enjoy their life there. Russia invests a lot of money to make the wall to like renew the wall infrastructure. And it's actually seen. I was there twice after the annexation, and I really saw the difference. So Russia really invests a lot into Crimea. But the problem is that for young people, they feel like they cannot go anywhere, because if you want to travel, you need a passport, and no country will let you use a Russian passport for travel if you are from Crimea. So you have to go to mainland Ukraine and make a demand for passport, and it's complicated because you are from the what they call temporarily occupied territory. So there are specific legislation that governs all those requests. So it's complicated for people who are mobile, like me, for example, who would like to be able to live a normal, comfortable life. So all this isolation makes young people question whether they really enjoy all that they have got. And I think that there is no right answer or right solution to the situation, because you cannot trade your ethnical identity to get something in return. So it's like, for example, in Spain, there is a how it's called, the region?
Catalonia?
Catalonia, yes, and it's a very similar situation. So according to the constitution of Spain, Catalonia cannot split without the referendum all over the Spain, and they believe that they will never win this kind of referendum. It was exactly the same for Crimea. Ukraine was a unitary state. So Crimea was not a part of like some sort of federation where you can just vote to, like Quebec, for example, can just vote to not become part of Canada anymore, and it's by constitution. But Crimea couldn't vote out, so you cannot solve this kind of problem easily without long-term consequences. And how long those long-term consequences will last, it's very, very, very hard to say, but it should last generations, I guess.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thanks very much for that excellent explanation. I spent 3 weeks in Kiev in the early 2000s at one point, and I remember, I had to choose, would I learn a little bit of Russian or would I learn a little bit of Ukrainian before I went there? And it was only when I chose Russian because I'm a big fan of Russian literature, and my grandpa spoke the language. But I realized when I got there how fraught that decision really was, or at least how it came across to people when I would explain, oh yeah, and so I chose Russian, and they're like, I got different reactions. So you moved from one place with cultural and linguistic tensions to another. I remember, being in Quebec every once in a while, people would tell me to speak French and things like that. And you knew a little bit of French, but so you moved there, and as I gather from your story, you looked around for a job and discovered you needed more time to learn some more French, and so you decided to become a student at the University of Laval, I think.
Yeah.
What was that experience like, starting to study in a language that you didn't really speak very well?
Well, I wasn't prepared to that. Honestly, myself and my ex-wife, we underestimated how hard it can be to move from post-Soviet republic to some Western country, because it's such a big difference in mentality and cultural and like just functional, like how society works. And we learned everything the hard way because we didn't have anyone in place to tell us what is the best thing to do. Like, for example, like a crazy thing that many immigrants do once they immigrate to Canada is that they keep all bills from all companies forever, because they think that maybe one day the government will want to verify something, and they will not have this paper with them. So they keep all bills, like for gas, electricity, water, and so on. So there is so much things that you like think that is true in the Western society, which is not actually true. For example, when I went, like my first year, I was a student, and I used bike to go to university and my backpack, and I needed to buy something at the grocery store. It was the first time I go there, so I entered the grocery store, and I have a backpack, so. Like, I automatically think that I should put it somewhere, because otherwise they will not believe that my backpack was empty or something like this. So I asked the woman at the cashier, like, where can I put my backpack? And she looks at me like very surprised and kind of, I don't know, why do you want to put it somewhere? And I'm like, because otherwise, how would you know that my backpack was empty when I will leave the store? And she was like, okay, you can put it here at cashier. So I felt so embarrassed, because it was crazy for me to think that they will just believe, like trust everyone who enters the store, that they will actually pay for everything they took. So, and lots of things like this, like sometimes when we have like evenings parties at work, I start counting, telling about all those stories, me in the first years of immigration, and everybody's laughing because there is so much like things that you think are true, which are not necessarily true. And for many immigrants, they never end up actually knowing how the society work where they live, because, for example, you saw yourself in Montreal, there are communities where there are Ukrainians, communities where there are Russians, Chinese, Indians, and so on. So if you, for example, why we did choose to move to Quebec City is because I didn't want to be part of any ethnical community. I actually wanted to learn the other way of living and see actually how normal, traditional society in Canada lives, their values, how people behave, how people think. And I think that in the long term, I made the right decision, but it was a hard decision, and it was a hard way to learn stuff because there is no one to actually answer any of your question. In 2005, when we immigrated, I think we were among maybe 80, maybe 100 Russians overall living in Quebec City. So there were no such thing as a Russian community. So we learned everything the hard way, but now I think that I really enjoy being part of this Quebec or Canadian society. My children who were born in Canada don't feel like they are different from any other kids of their age, and we actually behave and have the lifestyle of a typical Quebec family. We don't forget our Russian roots, of course. We speak Russian at home. We watch movies in Russian. We meet with people from Russia from time to time, but otherwise, we are just a normal Canadian family. So I think that it was worth it, I guess.
I've got a very specific question about being an immigrant in Quebec. So my understanding of the way the education system works for children is that essentially they get not ethnically but linguistically profiled before they enter school. And if you're from one background, if you're not from an if you're determined not to be from an English-speaking background, the government will not permit you to go to, the parents to send their children to a primarily English language school. Did you encounter that system?
Yes, it's exactly like this, and this one part that I actually against, and I'm vocally against. I regularly post on LinkedIn about major limitations that Quebec applies to people from other countries who live there, and not just that. In Quebec, there are many other problems, like, for example, the whole government administration costs much more to the taxpayer than in other provinces. But talking about this language question, as an immigrant from non-English speaking country, I don't have rights to send my kids to a non-French speaking public school. However, I could send them to a private school. So it just concerns public school, because they say that if the schools are financed from public money, then French language should be taught as a primary language. However, I should say that in the last year of the primary school, so it's the 6th year, children spend almost a half of the year in a fully English-speaking environment. So they have 10 days or 5 days of classes in French, and then another 5 days of classes only in English. And it's forbidden actually to speak French during those 5 English days. So my children, I think they speak start speaking English very well. And despite all those legislation, for example, there is a law that interdicts using other languages than French in working environments. However, most of companies today you speak both languages, English and French. So there is no any discrimination like that you would feel, but there are still laws that are still active, and sometimes government decides to enforce those laws, and it creates a lot of friction in the society. So there is no like a universal support of this French language domination. So all young generation, like I count myself as a young generation, and especially people who are still in college or university, everybody understands that you cannot live in Canada and only speak French, because you isolate yourself from the rest of the country and the rest of the world. So I think that it was at some point important to preserve French as a primary language, but in the modern society, you cannot just isolate yourself from the rest of the world and say we will lose our identity if we don't forbid other languages to be used. And I think it's not true, because I don't lose my Russian identity. I speak Russian with my kids and with my parents regularly. I still feel myself as Russian, even if I speak French most of the time at work or English. So the identity is not necessarily related to language, and nothing forces you to really like forget French. Like take Europe, for example, Sweden. Like in Sweden, English, it's like the second primary language. They speak English as well as Swedish, but they don't forget Swedish. They use it all the time in their normal daily life. It's just that when you work with such a diverse people from all over the world, English is the language that lets you communicate effectively. So I think in English, it's a universal inter-country language, and you have to know it. So there are some laws that still exist. I think that it will take time before those laws will be relaxed, and I think that immigration is part of. We have to solve the immigration part before we start solving the language part, because immigration, which is not where people come from Canada and stay in the ghettos or in some local communities forever, I don't think it's very beneficial for the country. So first of all, we have to find ways to make immigrants like actually integrate the society and make this experience pleasant, and not like force people to move somewhere or something like this. So it's not an easy question, but yeah, I agree that there are some restrictions that I don't really find appropriate in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you for that very nuanced explanation of things. I mean, there is a distinction between what the sort of formal laws are and what the day-to-day lived life is like.
Yes, I can give you an example. For example, in Quebec, you cannot drink alcohol on the street. But if you are sitting on a terrace in the downtown and you drink wine or beer, it's okay. Even if children will see you drinking wine, you are part of like environment in which it's okay. Even there are public places like parks where there are like wooden tables, and everybody can just, like any family can get to the park, like cover the table and put some food and a bottle of wine, and you can drink it, and no police officer will tell you anything about this, but everybody knows that it's against the law. So if you have very strict laws, but you apply them with moderation and is like with a thought, it's okay. I think to protect French language, it's okay. But if you force, like for example, there is a big network of grocery stores in Quebec, call it Metro, and the government actually wanted to force them to put the accent on the over the E to make it look French looking. I think it's ridiculous. So we have to apply laws with by thinking about consequences.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When people when Quebec kind of comes up in the headlines, it's often because kind of hardliners and the language police which there is an institution that can be appropriately referred to that way. They will go around and try to make you put the accent on the letter,
yeah.
Or not use even an English name like McDonald's or something like that, mm-hmm. with the apostrophe but the day-to-day lived life, people have their ways of getting along with each other. For example, it's a little bit different in Montreal because there are so many tourists there, I think, although Quebec City gets its fair share of tourists as well. But if you just barge into a place that's obviously a primarily French-speaking business and you just start speaking in English, it's a little bit rude, and you learn very quickly, try French first pretty quickly just to get it over with. Whoever you're speaking with will probably start speaking to you in English. But these little signals that you give of kind of that you understand the overall tension actually are things that people have more or less worked out.
I think that it depends a lot on your education as well. So, for example, I work with very highly educated people, and we all believe that English or French or whatever is just a way of expressing yourself. So, for example, when we talk during the lunch, we have people who speak English and other people reply in French. So we have like bilingual conversations easily. So I prefer speaking French, and some people at work prefer to speak English, and we just use two languages when we speak, and it's very fluent, and there is no any clash in this. So educated people understand that language is just a way of communication. People with less education and more prejudice. They could maybe judge you for not speaking French, but I will be completely honest. I live in Quebec City from 2005 and never ever experienced any negative perception by people from Quebec. So normally people are very friendly, and they ask you where your accent is from, where are you from yourself, you are Russian, this and that. And sometimes when I was not as good in French as now, and I started to try to speak French to people, they switch it easily to English and try to talk to me in English just to simplify the communication. So, of course, there are still people who believes that in some nationalistic idea, and that Quebec City or Quebec in general should be 100% French, but it's very highly exaggerated if you look from the outside. If you live inside, people are just people, and there are no good people or bad people. There are just people. So there are sometimes people with wrong opinion from my sense, but there is no any violence or something like this against immigrants.
I'm sure we could talk about this at length. It's such a deep and interesting experience, yes, especially to move into as an outsider. But getting back to your career, so you decided in the mid 2000s to study artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the prominent field at that time that it has become since. What led you to study artificial intelligence for your master's and your PhD? Every time everyone looks at their path in life, a lot in this path is an accident or a chance. So people either use those chances or not. It depends. But
very few depend really on our choice. So when I moved to Canada, I tried to find a job in IT. I realized that my French level was not enough to be effective at work, so I decided to go to study once again, even if I told myself back in Ukraine, university never again. I changed my mind, so I went to university because it was the only environment which I knew well. And in my opinion, it should be similar to university in any other country. So I went to university, and I subscribed to the program of what they call second cycle. It's like a graduate program. Master, but it wasn't masters. It was like just a graduate program in computer science. And during the first semester, it was really hard. As I said, my language was really not so good, and all classes in University of Laval are given in French. So I was one of few students whose language wasn't French. There was another girl from Iran. Or Iran, I don't know what's the wrong pronunciation, and another guy from Belarus. So we could speak Russian and explain to one another what we managed to understand during the class. So and while I was like the first trimester student, I started to look around and see if there are possibilities to start a master's and to have some kind of internship. And I met with several my then professors, and they all told me that they could find money, but not right away. So I have to wait. But one of them sent me to a director of the multi-agent systems laboratory, and like they told me that he might have money like to pay the internship like from the day one. So I met it. He has become my director for masters and PhD, Brahim Shaibdra, and his lab was specialized in multi-agent systems, but they also were interested in machine learning and in reinforcement learning, how to make agents behave in a collaborative or in a competitive way effectively. So my topic for master's and PhD was in game theory. So, for example, if you watched Beautiful Mind about famous mathematician John Nash, so my biggest contribution in my PhD was an algorithm that computes a Nash equilibrium in repeated games. So a repeated game is when the same players play the same game over and over again, and it's the solution is how you have to behave. Okay, and the solution depends a lot whether it's a one-time interaction or it's a repeated interaction, because in one-time interaction you can assume that there will be no consequences if you don't collaborate with other peers. But if the interaction is repeated, you can assume that if you don't collaborate, then your peers will be able to punish you in the long term. So the solution to repeated games is very different to the solution to what we call one-shot games. So I'm very proud about my contribution, and I see that my paper that I published in AAAI, which is one of the best top-tier AI conferences. It's very cited, and every year I have about a dozen citation of my paper. So from this point of view, I'm proud of my achievement as a PhD and master's and PhD student. But I think I'm much more proud about my achievement with the book, because the impact that my PhD did is very local. Like only a few, maybe a dozen people in the world will actually read my paper and appreciate the contribution. But with the book, I already estimate that my book has been read more than 10,000 times. So it's just like in a month after its release. So I think this achievement is much more satisfying than PhD.
Yeah, I've got quite a few questions to ask you about your book in a little bit, but I think this actually gives me an opportunity to segue into a question I often ask of people I interview on this podcast, which is, if you were starting out now as a young person looking for a career in tech generally, being a software engineer or a computer engineer, would you go to university again for an undergraduate degree?
I said today, yes, I would still go this route because online education is in the stage of very early stage. Even if it was a huge success, like for example Coursera and places like this, it's still not sure whether these diplomas in the long term actually means that the person will become a very qualified worker. So I think that it's too early to say that the traditional education is no longer relevant. And also it's more relevant in IT, in computer science, but it's much less relevant in let's say if you want to become an architect to build to construct buildings, or you want to become a physician. So there is not like an easy way to become one of those very complex professions. So in computer science, the whole computer science become more and more accessible. So it's easy to teach computer science by distance, but there are professions where you actually has to have a direct contact with the professor, a direct contact with your peers. You have to have lots of interactions individually and as a group. So this is what online education could not offer. But if you ask me, like, I consider myself as a progressist, so I actually believe that the traditional education, which has roots in the early 20th century, today is less relevant. But it's not just doing bachelor's or not. It starts from the primary school to the high school to the bachelor's to the master's. This whole system was designed to prepare factory workers. And today we are so the things we do are so different that trying to teach everyone to do exactly the same, it might be the wrong way. But there is the right way. Nobody actually revolutionized the education by offering something that will replace this system that teach everyone the same thing by something more individual. For example, I would appreciate if in school school could look at my children's talents and adapt education to develop those talents. That would be great. But the cost of such individual education would be much higher as well. And because you lived in Quebec, you know that in Quebec already taxes are over the roof. So I'm not sure that many parents would be able to pay even more for some kind of different education. So there is no right answer. I think that in some cases maybe the degree is not necessary like in computer science, but there are many other directions of education which you cannot just teach the same way.
It's interesting you bring up the taxes in Quebec. That leads me to my next question. So there you are, you graduate with this hotshot PhD in artificial intelligence, and you're in Quebec City where the taxes are high and where there are these restrictions on how children can be educated, and it's kind of remote and it's very cold, and you decided to stay. So I would like to ask you why you decided to stay and what you then did.
Well, first of all, I think that there is no optimal place on this planet. So wherever you go, what they say, you bring yourself with you. So I think our biggest challenge is within ourselves and not outside. So I think that Quebec is a good place to live. Of course, it has its own problems, as you mentioned and we discussed earlier, but you cannot find any place where there are no problems. I thought many times to move to California because there is so many hot startups there and lots of opportunities, but California has its own challenges that I might underestimate before moving there. And I thought about maybe retiring somewhere in the south of France because I speak French, and it's not. I don't say no to these plans, but at the same time, my children most likely will stay in Canada, or maybe not. But if they stay in Canada, I would like to stay close to my children. So moving, as I said, it's a challenge, and we are already survived one move from one country to another. So thinking about moving somewhere else, it's not as easy as it might seem. And I'm already 30, almost 39 years old. So at some point you have to decide whether you want to move all your life or you want to settle down and just try to get the best of where you are now. I think that compared to where I came from, Canada and Quebec in particular, it's a nice place to be.
And so you found a job there initially working for Fujitsu, I think?
Mm-hmm.
And what did you do for them?
Well, when I was still a PhD student, one of ex-PhD students of my director, he was a project manager at Fujitsu, and artificial intelligence at the time in 2010 was not as hot as it is today. So everybody spoke about it in California, and maybe it was one of the reasons why I thought about moving there at some point. But in Quebec, it was still like, AI, who needs that? It's just it's for scientists only. It will never work. And he was a manager there, and he invited me to join him because at the time Fujitsu wanted to build a innovation center in Quebec City, and they actually managed to get government support, financial and support from main Fujitsu from Japan. So it was all was about to start. So he said that it would be a good opportunity for you if you join us now, and then when we become big, it will play well for your career. So I accepted because I was interested to work with Japanese technologies and to innovate and so on. But unfortunately, the whole process of building innovation center took much more time than everybody could think. So after 2 years, they still were like in the very beginning, and people started to lose patience. Many people left the Innovation Center initiative, and I also felt like I spent 2 years not doing exactly what I wanted to do. So I started to look around, and I found a small Quebec brew company, call it Wanted Analytics, who specialized in the talent marketplace analytics, automated talent marketplace analytics. So they downloaded job descriptions from the internet and tried to extract information from those job descriptions. For example, what domain it is, what kind of skills are requested, what kind of salary offered, how long this specific job offering remains online. And they built all kind of models for big enterprises to help them orient their talent planning, where they have to look for this specific profile, how long it will take to find this specific profile, how much should I pay to this specific profile. So there were a lot of interesting questions that we could squeeze out of job descriptions, and I actually felt like it's an interesting product, and there is so many things that where machine learning could be applied. So as soon as I saw that they look for a data analyst, I sent them a link to my LinkedIn profile, and they called me for an interview, and I passed. So it was in 2013, I guess. So since then, Wanted Analytics was bought by one big American consulting company called CEB, and 1 year later, Gartner acquired CEB. So this is how I found myself working for Gartner. But so I switched three different countries without leaving my office. Well, sorry, companies.
Yeah. I have one, this before moving on to talk about your book, I have one question about that. So for people in the tech sector, most of them are familiar with Gartner because Gartner issues these quadrants, more or less kind of ranking companies and startups and things like that. So for those of us who mostly understand Gartner from the I'd love to be in the quadrant side of things, what interest does Gartner have in acquiring a company like Wanted?
Well, actually, when Gartner acquired CEB, only then we were told that actually Gartner looked at Wanted before CEB bought Wanted, but for Gartner, Wanted was too small as an acquisition, so they didn't decide to make an offer. But for CEB, we were okay, and for CEB, we fitted in their list of services that they offered to different companies. So CEB was kind of best practices company. So we have multiple clients, and we analyze how different clients work, and then we write a best practices document that we sell to all clients. So it's a subscription model, and all clients are happy about this. They are happy to share their best practices because they get good advice in return. So for CEB, this acquisition was part of their desire to also offer consulting in the talent space. And before buying Wanted, they also bought a company in India called Talent Neuron, and it was similar in the spirit to Wanted, but Wanted was much more automated. So what we actually did mostly automatically, but Talent Neuron was more manual. So they actually look at data online, build some kind of models to fill databases manually, and we did similar stuff but automatically. So for them, acquiring us, it was idea was that they will learn from us how to automate different data acquisition, data processing, modeling tasks that we learned to do through decades. So for CEB, it was quite planned acquisition, but Gartner bought CEB without actually thinking about us. They actually discovered that Talent Neuron and Wanted Analytics were part of CEB post-acquisition. And now Talent Neuron and Wanted are merged all under one roof, call it Talent Neuron. And it's one of the biggest priorities in advisory services of Gartner, and mostly because the amount of data that we have accumulated for the last 15, I guess, 19 years. It's amazing how much data we have, and we know who hired for what kind of skills in 2002, 2005, 2019, and we actually can build models that spans through years, and we can predict how different occupations would evolve by looking at how they did evolve in the past. So this kind of data, very few companies on the market have. Like Google, for example, just started to download and index job postings, so they don't have this amount of data as we do. And so we have several competitors, but data-wise, it's hard to beat what we have.
Speaking of modeling and data, that gives us a good segue into the next part of the interview where we talk about your book. What was the inspiration for the book?
Well, it was quite kind of funny because I never actually planned to write any book. I knew that it's a very time-consuming and energy-consuming activity, and I already worked on my PhD thesis, so I could say that it's not easy to write something readable and especially useful and interesting to read. So I always considered this as not a good investment of the time, because I knew also that authors often get maybe 10% if they are lucky from each book sale. So for me, it was like the effort didn't worth the outcome. But because, as you know, I have quite an active community on LinkedIn. I have about 80K followers now. So at some point in September or October 2018, I wake up in my bedroom and I look at the books that I have in my bedroom, and I had maybe about like half a dozen books on machine learning, and I realized that I bought those books, but I never finished any one of those. I read some chapters that was of interest for me at the time, but never be able to start a book from first page and go through the whole text till the last page. And I asked myself, why is this? And the answer that I've got is that those books are too thick for the busy life that we currently have. We never have time to actually sit down, make a cup of tea and read for some long period of time. So we always running, we always working on something like children, job, sport, and so on. So we try to do everything at the same time. So most of the time, if we need information, we Google it instead of buying the book and read it through. So I have written a post on LinkedIn by saying that modern books on machine learning are too thick and they are too technical for an average person like an engineer or a scientist from another domain to actually be able to buy this book and read it from A to Z. And I wrote that if I was to write a machine learning book, it would be a 100-page book. So it was just a post like this without really, I never planned to prove anything that I would actually be able to write this book. But somehow the post has become very popular. It has got about 1,000 likes and several hundreds comments. And there were two kinds of comments, the most frequent ones. First kind is people saying that it's impossible. So machine learning books are so thick for the reason you cannot just squeeze it without losing in clarity or in some important detail. So if there is some detail in the book, it's because it's needed. It was the first reaction. The second reaction was like, oh my God, if you are able to write this book, I will buy it because I'm so afraid of those 1,000-page books, which are typical in machine learning, that I will never be able to read 1,000 pages in my life, especially on such a complex subject like full of math and some difficult to get ideas. So I thought about this for a week or so. I talked to my parents, and they said, "Well, you have nothing to lose. Try to write several chapters, and you will see if it goes well." So I wrote the first 3 chapters, and it was about 30 pages total. And the first 3 chapters included introduction, basic math and statistics, and the description of the most important machine learning algorithms, like support vector machines, logistic regression, decision trees, linear regression, and k-nearest neighbors, I guess. So once I finished the 3rd chapter, I actually felt like there is not so much remaining to describe. There are neural networks, there are some ensemble methods, and there is also unsupervised learning. But unsupervised learning usually has much less algorithms, and it's used not as much as supervised learning. So I didn't expect to write a lot about unsupervised. So I decided to put these 3 chapters online and say that I will continue putting new chapters online on the go. As soon as they are ready, I will put them online. So I created a website and with a subscription, and people started to subscribe. So at the time when I finished to write the book, it took me about 3 months, and the mailing list already contained about 10,000 people. And I just sent, when I published the book on Amazon, I just sent an announcement that the book is now ready. You can buy it if you want. And also, I think a good idea was to put the book online under this principle of read first, buy later, which means that you can read the book in full, and only if you feel like the book actually was useful for you, you enjoyed the read, you can now apply the knowledge, for example, in your study or your business or your work, only then you should buy it. If you, for some reason, feel like it wasn't worth the time, then it's okay. And I think that people really like it, this whole idea from the day one. And I received a lot of comments from people who read the book while I was working on it, and I received a lot of corrections, suggestions how to improve the text, how to change sentence so that it sounds more naturally, and so on. So when I ended working on the book, in my list of contributors, I had about 60 people, and many of them actually read almost all chapters. So the contributions were not sporadic, but in many cases were systematic. So I was quite sure that the quality of the book was good. But if I knew how big the success would be, I would probably pay a professional copy editor to pass over the whole text and maybe find some places where the text could be slightly improved. But I'm quite sure that the quality is still very good.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions about the mechanics of how you wrote and published the book and how it became such a success in a couple minutes. But just before moving on, for those listening, I've got you. You're an expert. What is machine learning? You have a good description right off the bat in your book about where the term comes from.
Yeah, well, as I say in my book, there are like two definitions of machine learning. One definition is it's a part of computer science which wants to build computer programs that do some work for us without us explicitly defining how this work should be done. So machine learning, it's about giving examples, and the algorithm is being constructed automatically, which is based on those examples you give. This is one definition of machine learning. Another definition is it is an activity that you do to actually build those algorithms. So we can say I do some machine learning, or you can say I use machine learning to do something. So in both cases, it involves gathering a data set which contains of examples, and you give some labels to those examples. The easiest example is building a spam detector, and you gather a data set of emails, and to every email you associate a label like spam or not spam, and the machine learns automatically to distinguish spam messages from non-spam messages.
And what is the difference between machine learning and artificial intelligence?
Well, again, depending on how you view artificial intelligence, it could be an activity, or it could be a long-term dream. So when we build something, for example, a solution for business, a solution for business may be based on some machine learning model, but this solution is much more complex than just this model, because it's also how the input from the user is converted into something that machine can perceive, and then machine makes some sort of prediction, and then you have to show to the user the result of this prediction so that the user can interpret it and use it somehow in their daily life or business. So this whole solution with input preparation, output, post-processing, what we call artificial intelligence system. So machine learning is just some integral part, like a core of it, but it's not all. So artificial intelligence is usually it's a machine learning based product. But also artificial intelligence, it's a long-term goal and long-term research, like dream of people to build a machine that eventually will be able to interact with us just like we interact with one another. And this is where I think that there is artificial intelligence is overhyped right now, because people often mix these two definitions in one, and they think that we actually, when we say that I've built an artificial intelligence system, that we actually build some kind of thinking machine that we can actually interact with and talk about anything and so on. We are very, very, very far from this dream, and I would say that today there is no clear idea even how to get to the result that we dream about.
And another thing that's sort of famous around the subject of artificial intelligence is very famous and well-known people warning us about impending doom if we don't do something now. What do you think about that? Are you worried about whether it's really a thinking thing or not? Are you worried about what we refer to as artificial intelligence, taking over?
Well, again, as a practitioner, I think that we are nowhere even close to a machine that will realize that it exists, realize that it is some sort of intelligence, and understand its place on this planet, and then look at us around it and decide whether the machine needs us around it, or maybe we are just like some kind of noise. I think we are nowhere close to it, but I think there is a fear, and I wouldn't say that I really like think about this every day, but sometimes, especially when I'm asked this kind of question, yes, I think that what people really afraid of, what they call singularity, is when we create something and it's based on very simple idea, and we don't think that it will be able to become something more than this simple algorithm. But this algorithm is just a little bit more intelligent than everything we have built before, and it's sufficiently intelligent to be able to improve itself. And if this algorithm is be able to improve itself, it will become more and more and more intelligent, and this loop of improvement can be quite fast, especially if you run this algorithm on an infrastructure like Google, for example, has with tens of thousands of GPUs and interconnected computers. So, like, if you look at this as a science fiction writer and a scientist at the same time, there is a small chance that someone somewhere will run some kind of algorithm that will be able to improve itself so quickly that we don't even realize how powerful it will become. But again, as I said, today the level of technology is so below this threshold of self-awareness and self-improvement. So there are examples like, for example, AlphaZero or AlphaGo, where the machine plays against itself and learns to actually become a better player than the best human player. And what people say that there is nothing that prevents us to build a killing machine that will train on itself to kill the most effective way possible. But again, it all was tested in a very, very restricted environment, like game with very simple rules. The environment in which we live is much more complex. So it's not a chess or checker or Go board. It's a messy, big world with a lot of noise, uncertainty, and unpredictable events that can happen all the time. We don't have anything even close to replicate the same result as we have got with AlphaGo or AlphaZero.
Yeah, one really, I think particularly with respect to AlphaGo, people who sort of aren't experts but follow the tech news and feel that they're somewhat part of that world were quite surprised because Go was considered by sort of amateurs to be this, and probably by quite a few experts, but they would have been smarter about it. But as something that would take a really long time. Even given our current pace of change, really long time for a computer to be able to beat, grandmasters at, and then suddenly it happened, and people were like, wow, like what? It's not so much particularly that, although that is very significant. It was like, if we were that wrong about this and how long that would take, what else are we potentially wrong about? And one of the things that I, as someone sort of just who reads the headlines, find really interesting about the prospect of these very sophisticated programs, we might sooner than we think be in a world where we're being presented with very complex policies, like do this to cure the person's cancer from machines where we don't have any idea at all, how it arrived at that conclusion or why it's right. And so this is going to put us as humans in this relationship with machines that we're all accustomed to having towards human experts, right? When the doctor says, take this pill, it'll cure your problem. Most of us don't. We believe the doctor's right. We have no idea why, and we just carry on without feeling like anything uncanny or problematic happened. But if it were a machine doing that, it seems to change the dynamic in the way we respond.
I agree that some machines will be, and they already are more effective in some kind of work where humans dominated, and now, for example, like people who make it diagnostics of different kind of sicknesses, looking at X-ray pictures or other kinds of MRI and so on. They have to learn for 10 years or so to actually look at the picture and to decide whether it might be cancer or not, whether it might be this kind of sickness or not. And now we can just train a deep neural network, and it will look at the same picture and make even better predictions that humans do. And people might think that now the machine will be able to replace us everywhere, but it's actually a very limited range of applications where the machine could easily replace a human. And most of the time, it's a kind of activities where it's based on reflex, like human reflex. For example, self-driving cars. If you think about how complex the whole public transportation is, you think that we make so many decisions when we are driving to not get into any kind of accident. But when you drive, you quickly realize that you can think about something else. You can talk about with people about something, and you still keep driving without any accident because your brain learned to just react onto red color of the car that you follow, or red color of the lights on the intersection, and you just automatically make decisions. And when you can replace, actual decision making with using reflexes, this is where machine learning can replace you quite easily. So this person who learned for 10 years to see different kind of cancer on pictures, they don't use any advanced thinking. It's just they learned they look at so many different kind of pictures and read about so many different kind of sicknesses that their brain like this decides. It doesn't take the person like a day and multiple calculations to make this decision. They just look at it like this and decide, yeah, I think there is something here. We have to make additional analysis. So machine can replace this kind of decision making quite easily. But if it takes any kind of like thinking, logic, asking different people for different additional information, making calculations, this is where the machine is not near close to replace us. So I don't afraid about humankind being replaced by machines everywhere. There is a lot of places where, for example, it's important human touch, human contact, for example, in hospitals where people really need personal care, really need affection, empathy, conversation. So this is where machines will never replace us. And as I said, everything that takes additional thinking, manipulating different objects, different kinds of information in some non-reflex-like way, we don't have any theory in AI that could bring us there anytime soon.
It's really interesting. Your description of how we actually drive struck me. It reminded me of a joke a friend of my brother's has about how the car knows the way, and we often have this experience where we're kind of like, we don't, as you said, describe, we don't think about it at all, and just suddenly we're at our destination. Mm-hmm. You can even not remember, the last 10 minutes of what you were actually doing. Mm-hmm. So moving on to the last part of the interview where we talk about, go into the weeds a little bit about self-publishing. So you've already described some of your process for writing your book. It was when I was researching for this interview, it struck me as someone who works particularly in this area and in progress publishing, how familiar so much of it was to me, and how you did it all totally independently. One of the things, for example, that we've seen happen, and that is often, it always seems a little bit surprising, no matter how many times you see it, is that people will pay for books that they can get for free. And also that people will help you improve your book.
Yeah.
Authors love it, but as you've experienced, readers love it too. They love people like being able to help each other improve the things that they're doing, and it's sort of funny that we often the thing I reflect on most now is why is that something we find surprising, and where that comes from. But I wanted to ask you. So you've already explained a lot of how you did it. One specific question I have for you is around pricing. Pricing is a very tricky thing, not just in book publishing, but in all sorts of areas. And so you've got a Kindle edition on Amazon, you've got a paperback and a hardback on Amazon, you've got it up on LeanPub using a variable pricing model in an ebook format, and I believe you've also got an agreement to have a South Asian print version published.
It's also self-published.
Also self-published, and for a lower price, for the obvious reasons that purchasing power parity and things like that. So how do you have an overall strategy for how you're pricing all these different products, I guess?
Yeah, well, the pricing question was hard at some point because you don't know what your work is worth before you actually try to sell it. And I tried to ask my subscribers' opinion about what would be the most reasonable price for the hardcover book, and I actually created a poll where people could put their own opinion for the price. And I have got about 400 participants in this poll, and the average was about $35. But this is only if you exclude people who suggested prices something like $3, $5, $9. Why I decided to exclude those? Because on Amazon, my paperback book, just to print it, costs $12. Okay, so you cannot sell your book for less than $12. Otherwise, you will have to pay from your pocket for every purchase. So I excluded from the poll all suggestions that are below the print cost, and this gave me $35. So I decided to sell my book for more than this $35 because of the condition under which Amazon puts books on their store when you self-publish. So if you position your book, price your book at, let's say, $35, so 60% of 35, it's about $18 or $20. Then you subtract $12 for print, so what left? It's about $6 or $8. So I decided that if I sell my book in electronic format for $15, it would make sense to expect that I would earn $15 from paperback and hardcover as well. So all this printing and distribution, it's not directly related to the content. So if I price the pure content in the PDF or EPUB format for $15, then I don't see any reason to get smaller fraction of this by selling paperback and hardcover. So I calculated that for $45 paperback, when Amazon will take its part and when I will subtract the printing cost, what will remain is $15. So I price it all formats in all countries where I self-publish based on the same principle. However, I understood that in India, for example, I couldn't price it the similar way, because otherwise the price would be way higher than $35. It would be still lower than in the US, but for Indian reader it would be very, very hard as a price. So I decided to reduce my own share in the price of Indian edition. And if in India, I get about $5 from every sale. And so I decided to get fewer fraction just to make the book affordable for a typical Indian reader. But even with this, people still find that the price of $25 is still too high for India. Unfortunately, if I put price even more below that, there are two problems. One problem is that my fraction will become really tiny, and the second one is that if you sell your book in South Asian market for a too low price, many of those books got resold back to Europe and United States, because the content is the same, the quality is high. I didn't want to sacrifice quality in India, because for me, building a quality product is one of the reasons why I do things. I never do something like half-baked. If I work on something, I really expect a good quality result. So I couldn't reduce the price by reducing the quality. And I'm not ready to reduce my own share even more, because it becomes it becomes not fair for people who pay $15, for example, on LeanPub when they buy the book for the minimum of $20. So that people in other countries will pay less for the same amount of content they receive. So it's not an easy answer like how to better price. I understand that, for example, I would get much more sales in India if I priced my book in something about $5 to $10, but it would be what they call garbage quality books, like very thin paper, very, very bad quality binding, all in black and white, because my book is in color. So I actually wanted to preserve all those good qualities of the book on Indian market, but still try to somehow reduce the price without losing too much money from my pocket and without sacrificing quality. So I think $25 is what I can really offer without thinking that people in other countries pay much more for the same content. I think it's not fair.
And so you had this email list basically of people interested in the book, and so when you published it on Amazon, it shot to the top of one or two categories as a bestseller. I believe machine learning presumably was one of them. And then not very long after that, you were approached by enterprising publishers looking to translate the book. And I'm curious to ask you about that. I think a lot of people can find when suddenly they start encountering contracts and publishing companies and something like that, it's very exciting, but it's also a little bit daunting. You don't want to get screwed by bad clauses and stuff like that. So when you started signing contracts, how did you approach that? Did you get a lawyer? Did you read some self-publishing blogs or use your common sense?
No, I was quite surprised that the agreement that you sign is actually at most 4 or 5 pages. And actually, there are two main parts in this agreement. All other parts are the same. The two main parts is how the royalty is calculated. So based on what kind of price and what kind of percentage they apply to calculate royalty. And the second point is regarding the duration of the agreement. So I was contacted by quite quickly by Chinese, Russian, and South Korean publishers, and I saw that the duration that most of them, well, all of them proposed, it was 5 years. So I think that it was reasonable. I didn't try to negotiate anything below that. So I think 5 years would include this edition and the second edition. So I think it's fair. And for the royalty part, I was quite surprised that European model is very different from all the rest of the world, especially from let's say Chinese or US or South Korean. So in the rest of the world, excluding Europe, the royalty is calculated based on the list price. So the publisher decides how much the book will cost in stores. For example, let's say they decided in South Korea that the list price will be $20. Then they calculate the royalty based on this, and you can negotiate if your book is a bestseller. It's already known in the world. You are a best-selling author. Everybody knows your name. You can negotiate something higher than usual, but usually royalty is something between. They try to offer you something between 8 and 12%. So most of the time, people agree on something in between. So 10% royalty for someone who is not very popular as an author, and it may be the first book and so on. So I usually try to negotiate something close to 12, and in many cases I actually succeeded in get this kind of royalty. But I was really surprised that in Europe they apply royalty to the bulk price. So the price that the price that they sell books to retailers. So it's about half of the list price usually, but they apply exactly the same percent of royalty to the bulk price. So you can imagine that authors in Europe get twice, half of what authors get in other countries. And when I saw it first time in Russia, I was really surprised that they actually proposed these kind of conditions. And especially in Russia, the market is much smaller and the prices are much lower. So you can imagine that half of 10%. Applied to $6, it gives you quite funny amount of money. So I was interested in publishing in Russia basically because I'm Russian, and I want my parents to be able to buy a book with my name on it. So it was my only reason, and I actually insisted a lot on the quality of edition. But in China, in Russia, in Turkey, it's hard to sell books for something more than $10, and most publishers will really try to pressure you a lot to agree on the list price of about $6-7, which I always rejected because I thought that you cannot produce a good quality book that will be in stores for the price of $6. So the production cost should be around maybe $2 or $3. It cannot be of good quality. So I always insisted that the price will be at least $10-11, even if in Russia, in China, in Turkey. And usually publishers agree, but they want to keep prices as low as possible because they can forecast higher sales. And for them, sales is the only thing that matters. For me, sales are much less of importance. What's important is quality and legacy that I will leave with this book. Maybe this book will survive several editions, I don't know. So I would not like that my first ever published book in my life would be seen like a cheap, badly made and not worth touching even, because it's so low quality. So for me, it's important to have a projected image of quality author and someone who can build quality products.
Yeah, thank you for that very excellent and comprehensive explanation of how all these different parts intersect and how they're different in different parts of the world. I think particularly with respect to royalties, I think people are often very surprised to find out that the publisher's take is, say half of the sale price of a new book in a bookstore, and then the author's royalty is the percentage is applied to that half. So if someone sells a book for if you buy a book for $20, the author's getting $1.
Yeah.
And so people hear about it's a best-selling book, it sold 100,000 copies, and you think, well, the author must be rich now, and it's like, well, that's like a healthy amount of money to make. It's you're not getting rich unless you sell many, many, many books based on that model.
Yeah, and I actually every time people ask me like, is it worth self-publishing? And I definitely say yes. If you can self-publish in as many languages as you can, as you know, like for example, I know French, Russian, and English, but I could not self-publish in Russia because Amazon doesn't support self-publishing in Russia. So I didn't have a choice other than get an agreement with some Russian publisher. But I selected the most respected and the most quality ones. But in France, for example, in French edition of my book, I will self-publish on Amazon myself, even if I don't do translation myself, because I decided that I can find people who will translate the book much better in French than myself. My French is good for day-to-day communication, but for writing books, I don't think that I as good in French as I would be in Russian or in English. So I actually was lucky to find people who published author from France who was just interested to work with me on building the French version of the book, and I offered him to do it for some reward, but he said that he would do it for just his own pleasure and for exchange of putting his name on the cover as translated from English by, and he actually does a fantastic job. He already published in data science. His book is very well scored on Amazon in France. So I really believe that the quality will be very, very good. And I also have another person who will do copy editing for some flat price, not so high. And myself, I know French, so I will be able to do the third layer of quality check. And I really believe that the quality of French version of the book, self-published, will be no worse than would be published by any editor. But I think that I will use exactly the same approach if I succeed for Italian and Spanish, because in Amazon you can self-publish in Italy and in Spain. But for Germany and for German, I decided to work with an editor because German is much more different from French and English for me to actually make sure that the translation is good, that everything is consistent, and so on. So German was an exception, and also Amazon can self-publish in Japan, but I decided that I will not try to even write anything Japanese myself, because Japan is so different culturally, and their traditions are so different from Westerners. So I will wait for some good Japanese publisher to contact me. And I already was contacted by a couple, but we are still in some very slow negotiations. So I expect that someone more serious will contact me, and the whole process will go faster.
We're approaching feature length here, as I like to say in our interview. And so I would like to say it before moving on to my final question. If you're interested in more of Andriy's thoughts about Publishing, he's got a great post called How You Should Write Books in 2019 that I'll link to in the transcription for this interview. So my last question that I always ask people on this podcast is, well, in your case, you used our Bring Your Own Book feature. If there was one thing we could build for you or one thing we could fix for you on LeanPub, can you think of anything you would ask us to do?
Well, I'm not sure that LeanPub would fix the problem that I have, but the problem that I have with electronic books is that mathematics and math in general in electronic books is very poorly supported. So, for example, I cannot publish my book for Android or for Kindle because EPUB format supports mathematics in form of MathML, and Apple on iOS and on Mac supports MathML. So my book for iOS and for Mac looks as good in ebook format as it looks in PDF format. But on on Android and on Kindle, I cannot do it because Google decided to not support MathML. So I know that you don't produce your own readers yet, but if at some point you decide that you would like to build a reader, you would be the first company in the world which could support MathML completely without any flaw in electronic books. I contacted already several companies that sell e-books, for example, Kobo in Canada, and I described it to them that actually I cannot sell books for Android and for Kindle because of this limitation. And they said that, well, there is so much they can do. It's a problem of Android. It's a problem of EPUB and MathML. So we cannot do it. So if someone at some point decides to develop a reader for Android and for Kindle devices that would support mathematics natively, just like iOS does, it will be the first reader in the world for which I would adapt my book. Like right now, people who write books that contains mathematics, they put equations in form of PNG files, like images. So when you read an ebook and you try to scale up or scale down the font, the images remain the same size. So the whole text becomes super ugly, and just I didn't want my book to look like just a bunch of text mixed with some kind of hard to read equations. So yeah.
Thanks a lot for. We love hearing. I mean, we don't like hearing that people have problems, but we like hearing the details of the problems that authors are having because that helps us address them. If you write a book in LeanPub using our LeanPub flavored Markdown or Markua syntax, you can actually write math in LaTeX, and that we produce good-looking equations in PDF, EPUB, and Mobi, and on our iOS app and on our Android app.
Okay, if you can send me an example of a book and I would check it on Android app, if it works for my equations, I would gladly produce a version for Android of my book. But I actually downloaded all ebook reading applications for Android, and I tested them all with my book. And some of them just didn't render LaTeX at all. Some rendered LaTeX, but some characters were replaced by rectangles. So they were like lots of problems. So I'm really curious to test your system and try to type some equations that are of interest for me and see how it gets rendered on Android.
Okay, yeah, I'll send you. I'll find an example of a LeanPub book, and I will maybe send you a link to where in our manual we talk about it in the Markua spec.
Yeah, it will be very easy to test. I will just put some equations that don't get rendered correctly and try to read it on my Android phone, and if it looks okay, it will be great. I will prepare my book for Android based using your platform.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, and if you ever have any questions, I mean, I confess I'm not the technical expert on rendering math in our books here, but my colleague Scott is. So if you have any questions about anything, feel free to email us at hello, and Scott will answer you. Well, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to do this interview. We covered a lot of very interesting ground, and I had a lot of fun.
Thank you for inviting me, and it was really a great pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please rate and review this episode in iTunes and subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already. Thanks.